we are overlooking the most important thing. Deep within the rewiring of the human nervous system, a silent catastrophe has unfolded, not through a sudden explosion, but through the gentle, rhythmic glow of a billion glass screens. Imagine a world where the very sunlight of childhood has been replaced by the artificial flicker of an algorithm, where the bustling, chaotic, and messy interactions of the playground have been digitized and sterilized into a series of metrics. This is the story of a generational displacement so profound that it has altered the chemical composition of the adolescent brain. The protagonist of this tragedy is not a single person, but an entire cohort, Gen Z, the first generation in human history to go through puberty with a portal to a global judging gallery in their pockets. We see the archetypal protected child in the physical world, a being so shielded from the risks of the outdoors that they have lost the ability to navigate the friction of reality. Their parents, fueled by a sensational but misplaced fear of rare external threats, have kept them indoors, tethered to the safety of the living room sofa. Yet, in a staggering paradox of modern parenting, while we have overguarded them in the physical realm, we have utterly abandoned them in the digital one. We have handed them a phone-based childhood, a landscape devoid of adult supervision, where the predatory logic of engagement-driven software mines their attention for profit. The narrative arc of this crisis begins around the year 2010, a pivotal moment in the collective human timeline. This was the era when the front-facing camera met the high-speed data connection, birthing the selfie and the infinite scroll. Before this shift, the play-based childhood served as the primary laboratory for human development. In the wild, unscripted theater of free play, children learned the essential art of anti-fragility. They fell from trees, scraped their knees, negotiated the rules of a game, and navigated the complex social hierarchies of their peers. This was not mere recreation, it was biological training. The brain requires these low-stakes risks to build the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function and emotional regulation. However, as the experience deprivation took hold, the playground went silent. The sensational rise of the smartphone meant that the average teenager began spending more time interacting with a glass surface than with another human face. This shift created a disembodied existence, where social interaction became asynchronous and performative. The archetypal insecure seeker emerged, a soul that no longer looks to its own internal compass for value, but instead waits for the like or the comment to validate its right to exist. The psychological analysis of this stage reveals a chilling truth: we have TUOC'd out the very challenges that make humans resilient, replacing them with a digital environment that is designed to keep the user in a state of perpetual, low-grade arousal and anxiety. As the story deepens, the narrative explores the distinct ways in which this digital migration has fractured the genders. For girls, the tragedy is one of social comparison and perfectionism. The archetypal caged beauty finds herself trapped in a hall of mirrors, where every image she sees is filtered, airbrushed, and mathematically optimized to represent an impossible standard of loveliness. The sensation of being constantly seen but never truly known creates a psychic split. The social media landscape becomes a battlefield of status and reputation, where relational aggression moves from the school hallway to a 24-hour digital theater. The result is an explosion of depression and self-harm, a desperate attempt to feel something real in a world made of pixels. For boys, the narrative takes a different, but equally haunting turn toward withdrawal and defeat. The archetypal lost warrior retreats from the challenges of the real world, the pursuit of romance, the rigors of physical achievement, and the responsibilities of leadership, into the addictive loops of video games and online pornography. The digital world offers them a simulated competence, a way to feel powerful without ever having to risk actual failure. This leads to the failure to launch syndrome, where a generation of young men finds itself paralyzed at the threshold of adulthood, unable to navigate the demands of a reality that does not provide immediate dopamine rewards. The sensational core of this problem lies in the fragmentation of attention. The modern teenager's brain is no longer a cohesive instrument, it has been shattered into 1,000 shards by the relentless assault of push notifications. The archetypal scattered mind lives in a state of continuous partial attention, unable to engage in the deep work or slow thought required for intellectual and spiritual maturity. The technology companies, acting as the technological overlords of this story, have weaponized the most primitive parts of the human brain. They have mapped the dopamine pathways and the social instincts of a tribal species to ensure that the screen is never far from the hand. The result is an addictive loop that functions exactly like a slot machine. The psychological cost is not just a loss of productivity, but a loss of the self. When the mind is constantly pulled outward by the beckoning of the device, it loses the ability to cultivate an inner life. The solitude that was once the forge of character has been replaced by a lonely crowdedness, where the individual is surrounded by thousands of digital ghosts yet feels more isolated than ever before. This is the sensational tragedy of the Gen Z psyche. They are the most connected generation in history, yet they report the highest levels of loneliness and alienation. Analyze the underlying lesson. We must understand that the human brain is not infinitely plastic. It is a biological organ with specific developmental requirements that have been honed over millions of years. When we substitute the real for the virtual, we are not merely changing the medium, we are changing the creature. The lesson is one of biological mismatch. We have created a world that our prehistoric nervous systems were never designed to handle. To ignore this is to invite the total collapse of the social fabric. The narrative reveals that the anxiety we see in the younger generation is not a pathology within them, but a rational response to an irrational environment. They are the canaries in the coal mine, alerting us to the fact that the atmosphere of the digital age is toxic to the human spirit. The story forces us to confront the reality that we have prioritized convenience and connectivity over connection and character. We have built a world where it is easier to send a heart emoji than to sit in a room with a grieving friend. And we are now paying the price in the form of a shattered collective mental health. The scene shifts from the individual to the institution, specifically the hallowed halls of learning. The school, once a sanctuary for focus and social cohesion, has been invaded by the device. The archetype of the distracted scholar sits in the classroom, their body present but their mind miles away in a digital conflict or a viral trend. The narrative describes the death of the common experience, when every student is plugged into their own personalized algorithm. There is no longer a shared culture or a shared reality. The sensational loss of empathy is the direct result of this fragmentation. Without the face-to-face interaction that allows for the reading of subtle emotional cues, the social animal loses its ability to feel for others. The school becomes a place of parallel play, where individuals exist side by side but never truly overlap. The narrative demands a radical intervention, a sanctuary movement that restores the school to a phone-free environment. This is not about Luddism, it is about psychological ecology. It is about protecting the cognitive space required for the human mind to flourish. The lesson learned is that attention is the new currency, and if we do not teach the next generation how to guard it, they will be bankrupt before they reach maturity. We move toward the parental awakening, the moment where the protective guardian realizes that the greatest threat to their child's well-being is not the stranger in the park, but the device on the nightstand. The narrative depicts the struggle of the isolated parent, trying to fight $1 trillion industry alone. It is a sensational battle of David versus Goliath. The theory of collective action emerges as the only viable solution. The narrative argues that a single parent cannot change the culture, it requires a pact of the community. If we do not act together to delay the entry into the digital world, the social pressure will continue to crush the individual. The story calls for a new social contract, a commitment to return to the play-based model of development. We must let them be bored, let them be adventurous, and let them be offline. The psychological depth of this requirement is staggering, as it demands that we, as adults, also confront our own addiction to the screen. We cannot lead the children out of the digital desert if we are still wandering in it ourselves. The narrative intensity builds as we realize that the fate of the next century depends on our ability to unplug the present. The descent into the digital abyss deepens as we observe the systematic erosion of the social threshold, that invisible barrier that once separated the sanctity of the home from the noise of the public square. In the era before the Great Rewiring, the home was a fortress, a place where the archetypal emerging soul could retreat from the judgments of the world to integrate the lessons of the day. But the sensational intrusion of the smartphone has demolished these walls. Now, the judging gallery follows the child into the bedroom, under the covers, and into the midnight hours. The narrative of the anxious generation is one of relentless visibility. There is no longer a backstage to human life. Every mistake is recorded, every social slight is broadcast, and every moment of solitude is interrupted by the digital specter of what everyone else is doing. This lack of a private sanctuary prevents the integration of the self. The psyche, constantly under the pressure of external observation, becomes performative rather than authentic. The archetypal actor replaces the being. As children learn to curate a version of themselves that will survive the brutal scrutiny of the internet, while their true inner self withers from neglect, analyze the visceral impact on the biological foundation of life, sleep. The sensational theft of the night is one of the most devastating chapters in this chronicle. The blue light of the screen is not merely an illumination, it is a chronobiological weapon that suppresses melatonin and tricks the brain into a state of perpetual noon. We see the archetypal exhausted youth, a generation of zombies drifting through their days in the fog of sleep deprivation. Sleep is the time when the brain flushes out toxins and consolidates memories. Yet we have allowed the notification to become the master of the rest. The psychological lesson is clear: when you compromise the biological rhythms of a developing body, you guarantee a harvest of mental illness. Anxiety and depression are the natural outgrowths of a nervous system that has forgotten how to be still. The narrative demands that we view the phone on the nightstand not as a tool, but as a toxin that is poisoning the very wellspring of human resilience. The story takes a sharp turn into the marketplace of addiction, where the technological overlords are revealed to be alchemists of dopamine. They have taken the ancient, tribal instincts of the human animal, the need to belong, the fear of exclusion, the desire for status, and they have gamified them. The archetypal user is no longer a customer, but the product being sold to advertisers. The sensational reality is that the smartest minds of a generation are working night and day to ensure that a 14-year-old cannot put their phone down. This is the capture of the will. The narrative describes the death of choice, as the algorithm becomes the invisible hand that guides the thoughts and desires of the young. The psychological depth of this capture is terrifying. We are witnessing the first generation whose desires are being engineered by a line of code. The lesson learned is that freedom of thought is impossible in an environment of behavioral engineering. If we want the next generation to be free, we must first break the digital chains that have been wrapped around their dopamine receptors. The narrative flow now moves toward the shattering of the community. In the play-based world, the tribal elders, parents, teachers, and neighbors formed a safety net of observation. But in the phone-based world, this net has been shredded. The sensational isolation of the adult mirrors the isolation of the child. Parents, themselves addicted to the glow, have lost the ability to model presence. The archetypal distracted parent sits at the dinner table, their eyes fixed on a screen, while their child does the same. This is the severing of the cord, the breakdown of the intergenerational transmission of wisdom. We are witnessing a cultural amnesia, where the skills of conversation, eye contact, and empathetic listening are being lost in real time. The story forces us to look at the digital divide not as a gap in access to technology, but as a gap in access to humanity. The lesson is that mentorship requires proximity. You cannot raise a human being through a glass pane. The analysis of the play-based deficit reveals the archetype of the fragile hero. Because we have removed the scraped knee from childhood, we have also removed the triumph of recovery. In our sensational quest to keep children safe from physical harm, we have made them emotionally brittle. The narrative describes the safetyism movement as a psychological straitjacket. When a child is never allowed to navigate a conflict on their own, they never learn that they can. The result is a generation that views discomfort as danger and disagreement as violence. This is the birth of the fragile ego, a self that requires the world to be a safe space because it lacks the internal strength to handle a brave space. The lesson here is the law of hormesis. A certain amount of stress is required for a system to grow strong. By shielding children from stress, we have ensured their eventual collapse. The momentum builds toward the institutional revolution. The narrative describes the phone-free school not as a restriction, but as a liberation. Imagine the sensational sound of 1,000 children talking to each other at lunch. The return of the communal voice. The school must become the alchemical crucible where the individual is forged through interaction with the other. This requires the removal of the digital buffer. The archetypal educator must stop being a content deliverer and start being a guardian of attention. This shift is the only way to restore the intellectual sovereignty of the youth. The lesson is that learning is a social act, and the screen is the ultimate anti-social force. To save education, we must first save the physical presence of the student. We reach the call to collective action, the sensational demand for a new moral order. The narrative argues that we are at a tipping point. We can continue down the path of digital devastation, or we can choose the path of restoration. This requires the archetype of the rebel parent, the one who is willing to say no when the rest of the world says yes. But more importantly, it requires group coordination. The story provides the blueprint for the pact: no smartphones before high school, no social media before 16, and a return to unsupervised play. This is the Great Restoration. It is a sensational act of ancestral wisdom applied to a modern crisis. The psychological intensity of this movement lies in its simplicity. We don't need a new app to fix the problem, we need to put the old ones away. The lesson is that humanity is a choice, and we must choose it every single day. The narrative now reaches its final, most demanding stage, the archetypal awakening of the sovereign adult. For years, the sensational promise of the digital age was that it would provide us with the global village, a place of infinite connection and democratized knowledge. But as we look at the wreckage of the adolescent psyche, we realize we have instead built a digital panopticon where the villagers are both the prisoners and the guards. We are overlooking the most important thing: the anxious generation is not a failure of youth, but a failure of leadership. The adults in the story, the guardians of the gate, fell asleep while the walls were being breached. The final chapter of this chronicle is not a lamentation, but a manifesto for the great decoupling. It is the moment when the collective decides that the health of a child's soul is worth more than the convenience of a silent toddler or the efficiency of a connected teen. This is the sensational return to reality, an alchemical process where we must turn the leaden addiction of the present back into the golden freedom of the past. And lies the ultimate meaning that the book intends to convey. The anxious generation is a warning that we have fundamentally broken the ecological niche of human development. Hyde's core message is a radical call for the restoration of the real. It posits that a human being is not a data point to be optimized by a machine, but a biological entity that requires physical play, face-to-face friction, and the sanctity of deep attention to become whole. The book serves as a psychological exorcism, driving out the demon of safetyism in the physical world and the demon of exploitation in the digital one. It teaches us that to save the next generation, we must have the courage to be Luddites of the spirit, not by hating technology, but by loving humanity more. We must restore the play-based childhood as a sacred rite of passage, ensuring that the next generation grows up with calloused hands and a quiet mind rather than numb thumbs and a screaming ego. The climax of this journey leads to a state of institutional courage. The school, the home, and the government must act as a trident of protection. We move from the anxious self to the sovereign community, where the standards of childhood are no longer dictated by the engineers in Silicon Valley, but by the parents on the playground. The sensational power of this transformation lies in the rebirth of agency. When a child puts down the phone and picks up a ball, a book, or a conversation, they are performing an act of existential rebellion. They are claiming their right to a life that is slow, deep, and difficult, the only kind of life that has ever been worth living. The final revelation is that we don't need to fix the kids, we need to fix the world we forced them to live in. We are the architects of the sanctuary, and it is time to start building. We must stop overprotecting children where they are safe and start protecting them where they are in danger.